The Unity Tour featuring Bernie Sanders and Tom Perez kicked off this week, and as you would have expected, there were progressives who were enthusiastically waiting to hear Bernie Sanders speak. However, when it comes to Tom Perez, the new DNC chairman, well, they made their opinion of him pretty clear.
You guys, I still have 2 minutes left, all right? Like, come on. All right? So maybe you came, though, because you're curious about the new DNC chairman and the future of the Democratic policy.
That's not the best way to start off this event, if you ask me. However, when you turn to an article in the Washington Post, they give you a better sense of the crowd's reaction. They state, as the rally's hundreds of attendees waited for Sanders, the grumbling sometimes crashed into view. After the state's stage filled with volunteers, mostly young, a heckler yelled, "Why aren't the Bernie delegates up there?" Some of the senator's 2016 delegates were in a special seating area with VIP badges. A local Democratic Party leader said that the new chair, meaning Perez, would be arriving soon. There were a handful of boos. A state senator told the crowd that the political system was rigged. A heckler yelled, "Like the primary." So clearly progressives are not happy with the DNC, and they're certainly not happy with Tom Perez, considering he was one of the people that worked with the DNC to smear Bernie Sanders during the primaries. So progressives are perplexed by this. I'm perplexed by this because I don't understand why Bernie Sanders has agreed to go on this Unity Tour, considering he demanded that the Democratic Party, he's been consistently demanding that they carry out certain reforms, but they have yet to carry out these reforms. So, when you suggest that progressives should unify behind a party that's resistant to change, what you do is you surrender to them. You give up leverage. So, I disagree with Bernie Sanders' decision to go on the Unity Tour, but when you look at the first joint interview between Bernie Sanders and Tom Perez, Bernie Sanders, he just seems incredibly excited to be sitting next to the man that helped smear him during the primaries. Look at his face right there. Doesn't that seem like someone who is incredibly excited to be working with someone who he hates? But during this interview, I was expecting to come away with more clarification as to why it was the case that Bernie Sanders and Tom Perez were working together, because they're seemingly on opposite sides of the spectrum in the Democratic Party. And I really received no clarification here. I thought that it was really interesting because both of them said things throughout the course of the interview that were completely contradictory. Now, some question whether or not this Unity Tour was the start of Bernie Sanders potentially joining the Democratic Party, but he shot down this possibility early on in the interview.
Do you consider yourself a Democrat?
No, I'm an independent, and I think if the Democratic Party is going to succeed, and I want to see it succeed, it's going to have to open its doors to independents who are there are probably more independents in this country than either Democrats or Republicans. And it's going to have to open its doors to working people and to young people and create a grassroots party. That's what we need. And what the party has got to focus on are the most important issues facing working people. That's the decline of the middle class. That's the need to take on the billionaire class and Wall Street and the insurance companies and bring people together, A, against Trump's absolutely reactionary agenda, and B, fight for a progressive agenda, which among other things includes a Medicare for all single-payer program.
So Bernie Sanders is not going to become a Democrat, which is good news for progressives because they haven't done anything to earn his loyalty. He is the most popular politician in the country, so he has no incentive to jump on the Democratic Party's sinking ship. So I'm glad that he has agreed to not become a Democrat, but throughout Bernie's answer, namely when he talked about abolishing closed primaries, Tom Perez hasn't given us any indication that he's actually going to be doing that. And look, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it seemed like Tom Perez actually recoiled when Bernie Sanders said that. And you could tell it's because this isn't something that he actually wants. Now, Tom Perez was asked whether or not he supported the idea of a Medicare for all system. And this was his answer, if you can even call it an answer.
Is the DNC on board with Medicare for all single payer, Tom?
Well, you know, we want to make sure that health care is a right. It's not a privilege. And that's why we fought for the Affordable Care Act. That's why we want to continue to expand it. We want to make sure that everybody, and the Affordable Care Act has made tremendous progress. We have more work to do. And I think the unity, Chris, that we've shown in the recent efforts by Trump to repeal the Affordable Care Act have been an energizing force for Democrats, independents, others who share the values of inclusion and opportunity. And health care is absolutely a right in this country, or should be. It shouldn't be a privilege. And obviously we believe that as Democrats. Republicans don't appear to believe that.
So some people might listen to Tom Perez there and feel encouraged by what he's saying, because he is, I mean, make no mistake about it, he's using Bernie Sanders rhetoric. However, he's not actually saying that he's going to support a single-payer system. This is what he said verbatim. We want to make sure that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and that's why we fought for the Affordable Care Act. That's why we want to continue to expand it. But that's a contradiction, because if you do in fact believe that healthcare is a right, well, the only way to make it a right and codify it into law as a right is to adopt a Medicare for all, universal single-payer healthcare system, whatever you want to call it. But he's not unequivocally stating that he will in fact be endorsing this idea. So even though he's co-opted the language that Bernie Sanders is using, he's still not getting on board with a Medicare for all system. At least he certainly hasn't indicated that throughout the course of his answer. So this is really troubling, because he's saying one thing and he's trying to imply one thing, when in actuality he's not committing to a universal healthcare system at all. And that's not okay. That's disingenuous. That's misleading. Now, besides just using doublespeak and platitudes, one of the two things that Tom Perez actually does during interviews, well, he was asked about the perception that progressives have of him, about him basically entering the DNC chair race exclusively to crush progressives, because if you don't remember, Keith Ellison announced that he would be running for DNC chair about a month before Tom Perez announced it. And once Keith Ellison began to gain momentum and grassroots support, well, the establishment kind of pushed him forward, and he was really foisted upon us as a choice because they didn't want the Bernie Sanders wing of the party to get any control. So this was how he responded to the allegation that he was trying to put down the grassroots wing of the party.
Tom, I saw you speak last night in Maine, I believe it was, and you're talking to people in a lot of cases who there's a significant part of the party that feels like you were a stalking horse for the establishment, that you're there to sort of put down the Bernie Sanders wing of the party. You represent the one faction in this battle. People booed you. What is your message to those folks who are skeptical, particularly of you and what your leadership represents there?
Well, I thought we had a very good day yesterday, Chris, and the reason we have a good day is we have shared values. You know, we all believe that America works best when everyone has a chance to succeed, when we have shared prosperity, not just prosperity for a few. I believe that anyone who works a full-time job should make a livable wage and live a middle-class life. That's what the Democratic Party believes. We believe in access to higher education. Those are our values, and when we put those values into action, that's when we do well as Democrats.
So his answer was troubling. And I say that because even though he really didn't answer the question and he only responded with platitudes, well, the fact that he didn't answer the question tells us a lot about his intentions. If you're not carrying water for the establishment and you weren't there specifically to maintain control for the establishment wing of the party, you would tell them unequivocally that you're on the side of the grassroots. But Tom Perez can't speak to that because he hasn't reformed the DNC in any meaningful way that would signal to us that he's ready to embrace the Bernie Sanders wing of the party and the Bernie Sanders policies. And look, let's be completely clear here about the establishment's intentions. The whole reason why they wanted Tom Perez there instead of Keith Ellison was because Tom Perez is there to facilitate the continuation of the cash flow to the Democratic Party. He's supposed to protect the status quo. He's supposed to make sure that the faucet is still turned on when it comes to cash that is flowing into the party from lobbyists, from billionaires like Haim Saban. That's exactly what he's supposed to do. And Tom Perez gave us an indication that this was, in fact, his intentions when he refused to condemn the oligarchy who was rigging the system against us, who's buying our politicians. Take a look at what he had to say.
Do you see the world that way, Tom? Is that the Democratic message? Do you think it's important, as the senator sitting next to you just said, to say the ruling class, his words, of this country, are basically screwing average folks?
Well, listen, you know, when we put hope on the ballot, Chris, we win. When we allow our opponents to put fear on the ballot, we don't do so well. I believe that an economy has to work for everyone to be...
Hillary Clinton, no, this is my point. Hillary Clinton ran on hope. She ran on hope. It was a very hopeful message. And the point is, do you have to name the enemy? That's my question. Do you have to say, these are the people that are screwing you?
Well, listen, I think you're creating a false choice, Chris. What we have to do as Democrats is to articulate very clearly that Donald Trump's vision for America is a vision for the top 1% of the 1%.
If we put hope on the ballot, we win. All right, Tom, let me say this. If Chris Hayes thinks that you're using too much platitudes, Mother of God, you're using too many platitudes. You need to actually answer maybe just one question substantively. Let's make that a goal for Tom Perez. Answer one question truthfully without using doublespeak and without using any platitudes. That's the challenge that I'm posing to Tom Perez. I don't think that he could do it. Now, just getting back to the overall point of this Unity Tour, this interview did not give me any clarification as to why this Unity Tour is going on. I don't know why Bernie Sanders agreed to go on it because they're clearly both on different pages. They have entirely different messages. So if anything, after watching this interview, I'm coming away even more confused than I was prior to watching it when I thought it would yield at least a little bit of clarification. So I don't know why Bernie Sanders is choosing to do this. Now, if you try to put two and two together and look at the states that they are touring, you might think, well, you know, maybe it's the case that they're trying to campaign in red states to drum up support in special elections. However, that wouldn't necessarily make sense either when you consider the fact that the DNC completely ignored James Thompson in Kansas. They offered him little to no support until it was too late. So that's not an explanation that I think is persuasive to me. Now, Bernie Sanders was actually asked about this and asked about people's skepticism towards the DNC in an interview with Jake Tapper. And this was his response.
Are you concerned that the DNC, they're doing this big red state tour with you, but a lot of people criticized the DNC for not sending enough resources to Kansas. So it's great that they're doing this display.
Let's be clear. Let's be clear. I mean, the point here is that I think all over grassroots America, whether they're Democrats, Independents, or Republicans, people are perceiving that Trump did not tell the truth in his campaign in terms of what he would do as president of the United States. He was going to drain the swamp. Well, he's in fact appointed more billionaires to his cabinet than any president in history, et cetera, et cetera. So what I think has happened now in Kansas, it is true that the Democratic candidate lost. It is true that the Democratic Party should have put more resources into that election. But it is also true that he ran 20 points better than the Democratic candidate for president did in Kansas. So what you're seeing in Kansas, what you're seeing in Georgia, I believe you're going to see it in Montana, I believe you're going to see it all over this country, is that many so-called red states, working people are going to wake up and say, wait a second, Republicans want to cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and education, and they want to give hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 1%. No, that's not what we elected Trump to do.
So overall, I think that maybe what Bernie Sanders is doing, if I can speak for Bernie Sanders, is he's trying to go on this tour so that way he can break down this red-blue state dichotomy, which he thinks is false. However, Bernie Sanders doesn't need the DNC to tag along with him to do that. Bernie Sanders was already making progress. I mean, this is an anecdotal example, but when you look at the town hall he held in West Virginia, he convinced a room full of Trump supporters to support a single-payer healthcare system. So Bernie Sanders doesn't need Tom Perez to do this. If anything, Tom Perez is going to be counterproductive because we all know that Tom Perez is a corporatist tool of the establishment. He doesn't want a single-payer system. Otherwise, he would have unequivocally stated that he's in favor of that. So this is my message to Bernie Sanders. Bernie, as one of your most vocal supporters, I don't know why you're going on this Unity Tour, and I don't like it. But let me tell you this, millions of people support you, and we love the fact that you are continuing to talk about the issues because you're actually having an impact on the national conversation. I think without Bernie Sanders, without you, we would not be talking about a Medicare for All system right now. So what Bernie Sanders is doing is excellent. But Bernie, if going on this unity tour is really an attempt by you to reform the Democratic Party, your effort here will not work. If you really want to reform the Democratic Party and think that it's possible, I'm skeptical that it is at this point, but if you truly believe that the Democratic Party is salvageable, Bernie, here's what you got to do. You have to get tough. You can't continue to play nice with them. You can't go on this unity tour and suggest that you want us to align behind their corporatist agenda, because that's not going to happen, Bernie. If you really want the Democratic Party to change, you have to show them some tough love. You've got to abandon them. They have to lose some elections if they're ever going to learn their lesson. So I still don't get this unity tour. I'm not getting off the Bernie bus because of it, but certainly I think that Bernie Sanders owes it to his supporters to explain to us why it is the case that he's going on this unity tour, because Tom Perez and the DNC, they are a symbol of everything that's wrong with the country. So I don't get it. I still don't get it. And this interview and anything that Bernie Sanders really said doesn't make it that much more clear. So I wish that we had some clarification, but I really am worried that this will hurt Bernie Sanders' image among progressives. It makes it seem as though you're abandoning us for the establishment. And that's not good. Now, I don't think Bernie Sanders is doing that. I believe that he does have altruistic intentions. But Bernie Sanders, if you really want to reform the Democratic Party, be tough on them.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.